distinction between us and them. And of course, neither I nor anyone else can presume to speak for us, but I'll pretend it's possible. There's also a problem about the word crisis. Which one do we have in mind? There are numerous very severe crises. Many of them will be under discussion here in a couple of weeks at the United Nations and their conference on the world financial and economic crisis. And these crises are interwoven in very complex ways which make it, which preclude any sharp separation. But again, I'll pretend otherwise for simplicity. Well, one way to enter this morass was helpfully provided by a current issue of the New York Review, dated yesterday. The front cover headline reads, "How to Deal with the Crisis." Features a symposium of specialists. That's worth reading, but with attention to the definite article, the crisis. For the West, the phrase "the crisis" has a clear enough meaning. It's the financial crisis that hit the rich countries and therefore is of supreme importance. But in fact, even for the rich and privileged, that's by no means the only crisis or even the most severe of those they face, and others see the world quite differently. For example, the newspaper New Nation in Bangladesh. There we read, "It's very telling that trillions have already been spent to patch up leading world financial institutions, while out of the comparatively small sum of $12 billion pledged in Rome earlier this year to offset the food crisis, only $1 billion has been delivered. The hope that at least extreme poverty can be eradicated by the end of 2015, as stipulated in the UN's Millennium Development Goals, seems as unrealistic as ever, not due to lack of resources, but to a lack of true concern for the world's poor." They're talking about approximately 1 billion people facing starvation, severe malnutrition, even 30, 40 million of them in the richest country in the world. That's a real crisis, and it's getting much worse. In this morning's Financial Times, British business press, it's reported that the World Food Program just announced that they're cutting food aid and rations and also closing operations. The reason is that the donor countries have been cutting back funding because of the fiscal crunch, and they're slashing contributions. So there's a very close connection between the horrendous food crisis and poverty crisis and the significant but less significant fiscal crisis. They're ending up closing down operations in Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, many others. They have to 20 to 25% cut in budget, and while food prices are rising and the financial crisis, the general economic crisis, is bringing unemployment and cutting back remittances. That's a major crisis. We might incidentally remember that when the British landed in what's now Bangladesh, they were stunned by its wealth and splendor, and didn't take long for it to be on its way to become the very symbol of misery, not by an act of God. Well, the fate of Bangladesh should remind us that the terrible food crisis is not just a result of Western lack of concern. In large part, it results from very definite and clear concerns of the global managers, namely for their own welfare. It's always well to keep in mind an astute observation by Adam Smith about policy formation in England. He recognized that what he called the principal architects of policy, in his day the merchants and manufacturers, make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, however grievous the impact on others, including the people of England, but far more so those who were subjected to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, and particularly in conquered India, his own prime concern. We can easily think of analogs today. His observation, in fact, is one of the few solid and enduring principles of international and domestic affairs, well, to keep in mind. And the food crisis is a case in point. It erupted first and most dramatically in Haiti in early 2008. Like Bangladesh, Haiti is a symbol of utter misery. And like Bangladesh, when the European explorers arrived, they were stunned because it was so remarkably rich in resources. Later it became the source of much of France's wealth. I'm not going to run through the sordid history, it's worth knowing. But the current food crisis traces back directly to Woodrow Wilson's invasion of Haiti, which was murderous and brutal and destructive. Among Wilson's many crimes was to dissolve the Haitian parliament at gunpoint because it refused to pass what was called progressive legislation, which would allow U.S. businesses to take over Haitian lands. Wilson's Marines then ran a free election in which the legislation was passed by 99.9% of the vote. That's of the 5% of the population permitted to vote. All of this comes down to us as what's called Wilsonian idealism. Later, U.S. aid instituted programs in Haiti to turn it under the slogan of turning Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean by adhering to the sacred principle of comparative advantage. That is, they should import from the United States while working people, mostly women, slaved under miserable conditions in U.S.-owned assembly plants. Haiti's first free election in 1990 threatened these economically rational programs. The poor majority made the mistake of entering the political arena and electing their own candidate, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a populist priest. And Washington instantly adopted standard operating procedures, moving at once to undermine the regime. A couple of months later came the military coup, instituting a horrible reign of terror, which was backed by Bush. Bush won, and even more so by Clinton. By 1994, Clinton decided that the population was sufficiently intimidated, and he sent U.S. forces to restore the elected president. That's now called a humanitarian intervention, but on very strict conditions, namely that the president accept a very harsh neoliberal regime, in particular, no protection for the economy. Haitian rice farmers are quite efficient, but they can't compete with U.S. agribusiness that relies on a huge government subsidy, thanks to Ronald Reagan's free market enthusiasms. Well, there's nothing at all surprising about what followed next. In 1995, U.S. aid wrote a report pointing out, I'm quoting it, that the export-driven trade and investment policy that Washington mandated will relentlessly squeeze the domestic rice farmer. In fact, the neoliberal policies rammed down Haiti's throat, destroyed, dismantled what was left of economic sovereignty, drove the country into chaos, and that was accelerated by Bush #2's banning of international aid on totally cynical grounds.